Okay, so welcome to the punctuation recap video. This is kind of focusing on key punctuation that you guys need to be looking at and getting your head round for the writing exam. This is relevant for all levels, really. Not all punctuation is needed at all levels, but especially for those aiming for level 1, level 2, this is really, really important to be focusing on in terms of your proofreading at the end of each task that you write. So it is worth sort of just reminding yourself about what we need to be aiming for in those exams. Now, I know you know when to use capital letters, but just as a quick reminder, whenever we are using what we call a proper noun, so when we are being specific or using the special or particular name of something, we need to have that capital letter. So for instance, if I was being general and just sort of said the car or a car does not need a capital letter. But if I'm using the specific special name of that car, i.e. the make and model, like the Ford Fiesta would get capital F for both. Again, for instance, if we're talking about a cafe, if I just said, I'm going to go to the cafe tomorrow, cafe is a very general word. It's not specific. It's not the special name of a place. It does not get the capital letter. But if I said to you, I'm going to go to Costa tomorrow, Costa is a branded name. It's a company. It needs that capital letter. Other things that need capital letters that fall into this same kind of category. So names of people, obviously, places. So that includes things like in your addresses when you're writing a letter. Every part of the name places get a capital letter. So if you said Tennyson Avenue, not only does Tennyson get a capital T, but Avenue gets a capital A as well. I don't know, Smith Lane would get a capital L, etc. as well. And again, in an address, when you've got a postcode, the letters that are in the postcode ought to be capitalised as well. So companies, businesses, particular sort of buildings, for instance, so College of West Anglia, that college is, has a special specific name, so it gets capital letters for all parts of that name. Days of the week, months of the year, special events and festivals and things like Eid, Diwali, Christmas, Easter, Remembrance Day, International Women's Day, they all get capital letters as well because it's the specific name given to that day. Languages and nationalities also get capital letters as well because it links to sort of the name of the country. Other situations, whenever you use the word I, because it stands in place of your name, it needs to be a capital as well. Something called acronyms and abbreviations. So things like, the United Kingdom. When we say UK, we use capital letters for each letter in it, don't we? NHS, National Health Service. When we're being lazy and we're shortening things down, again, College of West Anglia, who wants to be writing that out all the time? And it's okay to use it in this short form, but we need to make sure we're using capital letters for it. And of course, everybody knows start of every sentence needs to have a capital letter. A couple of things that you may not know, things like north, south, east and west don't actually need a capital. We do sometimes give them to them, but they don't technically need one. And also school subjects, so things like maths, science, design technology, unless they're being shortened. So like physical education, when it gets shortened into PE, because it's shortened, like these ones, we capitalise it. But if we were just writing it out normally, physical education doesn't need capitals, okay? Unless it's a language. So if you're learning French or German or Spanish or Latin or English, then it would get a capital. So just be wary of that for me, ladies and gents. Okay. Now, end of sentence punctuation. Again, I know you know this stuff. Most of the time we're using that full stop, and that sort of shows the end of the sentence. We've come to the end of our point or our idea. Done, dusted, on to the next one. However, a couple of times when we don't, if we are asking for information, we ought to be using a question mark. And if we are showing sort of shock or anger or some, really strong emotions, we might use that exclamation mark at the bottom. What we need to avoid, though, we do this on social media and we do this in like text messaging and things. A lot of people will use multiple exclamation marks. You don't need to be doing that in your writing exam. One is more than enough to show what you're trying to do. The examiners will question whether you know how to use it properly if you put loads. Another thing that we ought to avoid is this, where we put a question mark and an exclamation mark together. We do need to try and avoid that because, again, the examiner's going to sit there and go, well, which one did they really want to use? Do they know what they're trying to do here? And although we do it, as I say, on social media and so on, we've just got to be careful. Now, the reason why I'm going over this, in an exam, it's so easy to miss little things like this when we're typing or writing under pressure. We need to be careful in going back and proofreading and making it clear where our sentences end. Quite often we'll get what would be a really clear sentence, whole idea, whole point, and then it just blurs and goes straight into the next sentence. We need to avoid that. We can't just have sentences sitting side by side. We can't just have them sitting there doing nothing with no clear separation and no clear joining. So what we ought to be doing, full stop, capital letters, to make sure it's really clear where each sentence, point, or idea comes to the end, like that. We can join sentences together. We're going to talk about that in just a moment, but we need to be really, really careful because if not, what we had was one long sentence from that capital letter at the start to that full stop at the end. That was a really long sentence. It was one sentence, so not a properly structured paragraph, for one. And two, that sentence was not properly structured. There was too many parts just sat side by side. So we either need clear separation with the full stop and the capital letter, or we need to join them together carefully. What I will say, a comma is not a way of finishing a sentence. So if you had just gone in and done this, done comma, 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 that doesn't join together the parts of the sentences properly. Okay, these sentences work on their own as small sentences, small ideas. They don't work on their own. So you cannot glue them together with commas. This is called comma splicing. We need to avoid this. So we're going to talk about how to do that properly in a minute. But I just wanted to make it very clear, a comma does not end a sentence. Only the full stop, the exclamation mark, or the question mark does. So you need to be really, really careful, guys, and make sure that we haven't got this kind of blurred, what could be a really good but is not yet a paragraph situation. We do have to be proofreading for that as carefully as we can. Okay, so where we're starting to get into the sentences themselves now, we're going to start thinking about how we can structure them. If you are writing a list, okay, or for instance, using rule of three, remember that's a kind of list, that language technique, we need to use commas to separate each of the items in our lists, except for the last two. Oh, hang on, sorry, my pen's going wibbly wobbly. The last two items. So where we've got cola and lemonade in that shopping list, we don't need a comma because we've got the word and there. It's already doing the job of separating those two items for us, so we don't need a comma as well. We might sometimes use or instead of the word and if we're sort of showing options. I could have pizza for dinner, I could have pasta for dinner, or I could have Chinese takeaway. So I could use it in my list if I'm talking about options. but we still would need a comma to separate the other items. Okay. Now, lists I'm sure you've come across before. I think that's probably one that we're familiar with. What we've got to be careful is this comma splice here. So where we've got two small sentences that would work as little sentences on their own, if I'd put a full stop there, they would work as two separate sentences. They're a whole complete idea. They make sense on their own. We cannot just glue them together with a comma like that. That is wrong. That is not going to be what the examiners want to see. We need to avoid this. No, thank you. What we can do, we can use a comma, but we need to use it with a conjunction or a joining word. So things like also, things like but, so, or, yet, for, nor, as, because. These are all really good joining words. Things like since, we can use since, while, or even whilst. They work to join this bit of the sentence to this bit. So these two separate ideas, this word in the middle it not only does it join them, it shows us how they go together, how they work together. Your choice of word will depend on what you're trying to talk about in these two separate sentences. So we call them compound sentences. You've just got to remember, can't just glue them with a comma. They make sense on their own, so we can't glue them with a comma on its own. It's got to have a joining word as well. Okay. There is a slightly different kind of sentence, though, where we can use the commas to add extra information. So the way we need to think about this one, okay, we will have a main bit that works as a sentence on its own. It makes sense. So Gabby walked home. That makes sense on its own. It would work as a little sentence. I could break it away. I could get rid of the other bit and it works on its own. However, if I'm adding in some more detail, sometimes the other chunk, if I break it away, it doesn't make sense on its own. So if I said to you, although it was late, it doesn't make sense. It sounds unfinished, like there's more information to come. And that's because of the conjunction at the start there, that joining word. Because it's at the start, it's not finished. There's more information to come. So when we're in this situation with extra info, and it doesn't work as a little sentence, that is when we can use a comma to add it and show where it joins onto the main sentence. If we play around with where that extra information is, if it comes second, it's turned into one of those compound sentences where we've got the comma and a joining word joining together two separate sentences. Sometimes that extra information comes in the middle of a sentence, and again, that's absolutely fine. But what we need to do is to put a comma at the start and at the end of that extra information to show where it sits in the sentence. Okay, sometimes that extra information isn't always a whole chunk like that. It might only be one word. So little things like yes, no, oh, they are all extra information that we could take away from the main sentence and it would still make sense. So that's the way to think of it in this situation. Have I got a main sentence that makes sense? Yes, I have. Have I got extra bits that, if I take them away, don't work on their own? If I just said Greta, again, it's unfinished, isn't it? It doesn't sound like there's, enough there. I need something more for it to make sense. So we think of it as extra information again, joining onto the main sentence. So in this situation, where we've got extra information, we need a comma to show where it joins onto the main sentence. That's the key difference between this kind of sentence and the compound one. Remember, the compound is where we've got two sentences we're putting together. In this scenario, it's different. We've got one main sentence and extra information that does not work as a sentence. Okay, guys, so let's move on. Let's go nice and quickly because I know you're bored already. Let's think about apostrophes. So when we are being informal, when we are being chatty, more casual, when we're writing and talking to friends and family, when we're talking online, so web discussions or websites and things, we might use these contracted words where we use the apostrophe to show the missing letters, where we've shortened words down, shortened them together. Okay, that's absolutely fine. It tends to be more informal. If your situation is more formal, I'd try and avoid these contracted words, to be fair, because again, that just shows the examiner that you know the difference between the formal and the informal situations. However, sometimes things are a bit different. We need apostrophes in a different situation when we are trying to show that something belongs to someone. Now, people get confused over where the apostrophe goes. It depends on how many people we're talking about. If I said the girl's dog, you have my little drawing of the girl there. The dog belongs to one girl, then the apostrophe goes before the S. However, if we had more than one girl, say I had two daughters and I had a pet dog that I bought for them, I would say, oh, it's the girl's dog. And because I'm talking about more than one girl, the apostrophe goes after the S. We do need to be careful, though, in some situations where if we're talking about a person, perhaps, and their name ends in an S, it can also get a little bit confusing. But the S is part of that person's name. So if we talked about James, his name has an S on the end, so we can't put the apostrophe before that S. We would have to put it after to show that something belongs to him. We can do it this way with just the apostrophe, or we can do it with another S on the end as well. It doesn't have to be ES, it should just be S apostrophe S like that. Either of those is fine. You would not lose marks for going with one or the other. Either is fine. So just be aware of that. It doesn't come up often, but just in case it did. Colons and semicolons then. These are the last two bits of punctuation I want to talk to you about. They are a nice way of boosting your marks because if we can include these in some of the stuff that we do already, because there's certain situations where we might use these, they are a good way of showing the examiner you can use higher level punctuation. And they are really clever because if we are writing a list or we are introducing something, introducing further information, not only do we need to put the commas in to separate the items in our list, but we can sneak a colon in at the start of the list and boost our marks. And it's not essential, you don't have to have this with every list, but it, as I say, is a nice way of showing the examiner that you can use some of the higher level marks. Semicolons, on the other hand, are a nice way of joining together two small sentences. So before, do you remember I said we can't just have two sentences that, if they make sense, we can't just glue them together with a comma? If we find we're in that situation where we have, and we can't think of a joining word, well, actually, if we put in one of these semicolons instead, a semicolon does the same job as a comma and a joining word. So again, this is a higher level piece of punctuation, but a nice sneaky one that will help you to A, structure your sentences really, really well, but B, again, show the examiner just what you know and just what you can do and can help you to boost your marks. So that's me at the end of that PowerPoint, guys. I'm sorry that wasn't the most exciting recap, but hopefully that will just give you a few hints and tips there of what to look for, what to focus on, what to be remembering when it comes to your proofreading at the end of each writing task in your exam. As always, if you've got any questions, please email us or message us on Learn. You can get hold of me at gabby.merry cwa.ac.uk.